I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're cleaning a kitchen, folding laundry, or coming home from work after another long day. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise you, today's story will touch something deep in your heart. In the heart of Chicago, where the wind cuts through the soul as sharply as it whips off Lake Michigan, there lived a woman whose name was Rosa Delgado. Her hands told the story of 47 years, weathered and calloused from decades of scrubbing floors that would never belong to her, washing dishes that fed mouths that barely acknowledged her presence, and carrying the invisible weight of other people's lives on her shoulders. Each morning at 4:30, Rosa's alarm would pierce the pre-dawn darkness of her studio apartment on 18th Street in Pilsen. The radiator would rattle like old bones, and through the thin walls, she could hear the Morales family next door preparing for another day at the steel mill. The aroma of fresh tortillas and strong coffee would drift through the hallways of the red brick building, mixing with the distant rumble of the Pink Line train that carried Chicago's working souls to their daily destinations. Rosa had been a maid for 23 years. She had cleaned penthouses overlooking Navy Pier, scrubbed marble floors in Gold Coast mansions, and dusted crystal chandeliers worth more than most people's annual salaries. But her current assignment was different, colder, more hollow than any place she had ever worked. The Canterbury Mansion in Lincoln Park stood like a fortress of indifference, its Georgian facade hiding rooms that echoed with loneliness more than laughter. Behind those walls lived Richard Canterbury, a man whose net worth exceeded $40 million, whose investment portfolio included everything from blue-chip stocks to emerging cryptocurrency, and whose real estate holdings stretched across 3 states. Yet for all his wealth, Richard was the poorest man Rosa had ever encountered. The mansion seemed to exhale sadness with each gust of winter air that rattled its windows. Richard had built his fortune through strategic investments and ruthless business acumen, turning a modest inheritance into an empire that spanned technology, real estate, and financial services. His name appeared on Forbes lists, his opinions moved markets, and his decisions affected thousands of jobs. But 5 years ago, when his wife Margaret had succumbed to cancer, something inside Richard had died with her. The house that had once hosted charity galas and intimate dinner parties now stood silent, its 37 rooms serving as monuments to a grief that seemed to seep through the very walls. Rosa first arrived at the Canterbury Mansion on a bitter February morning when the lake effect snow was falling so hard that even the city buses were running behind schedule. She had taken 3 different trains from Pilsen, her worn leather purse clutched tightly against her chest, containing everything she owned of value, her identification papers, $43 in cash, a rosary her mother had given her, and a photograph of her younger brother Miguel, who had died in Iraq 7 years earlier. The mansion loomed before her like something from a movie, with its iron gates and circular driveway where a black Mercedes and a silver BMW sat covered in snow. The front entrance was flanked by columns that seemed to reach toward heaven, though Rosa suspected heaven felt very far away from this place. Mrs. Harrison, the head housekeeper, opened the door with the expression of someone perpetually annoyed by the world. She was a thin woman in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back so tightly that it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent scowl. "You must be the new girl," she said, looking Rosa up and down with undisguised disapproval. "I suppose you'll do until we find someone more suitable. The agency said you have experience with large homes." Rosa nodded quietly, following Mrs. Harrison through hallways lined with oil paintings worth more than Rosa's family had ever seen. The floors were marble, imported from Italy, and every step echoed like a judgment. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, their light reflecting off surfaces so polished that Rosa could see her own nervous face staring back at her from every direction. "Mr. Canterbury is particular about his privacy," Mrs. Harrison continued, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "He doesn't like to be disturbed, spoken to unless absolutely necessary, or reminded that staff exist in his house. You're here to clean, not to be seen or heard. The other staff, Thomas the butler, myself, and Elena the cook, we've been here for over a decade. We know how things work. You don't." The tour of the mansion felt like walking through a museum dedicated to wealth and indifference. The living room contained furniture that Rosa recognized from magazine spreads, pieces that cost more than her annual salary. The kitchen was larger than her entire apartment, with appliances that looked like they belonged in a space station. Upstairs, bedroom after bedroom sat empty, their beds made with sheets that probably cost hundreds of dollars but had never been slept in. And everywhere, photographs of the late Mrs. Canterbury smiled down from silver frames, her presence haunting every corner of the house like a beautiful ghost that refused to let the living move forward. Mrs. Harrison led Rosa to the servants' quarters on the ground floor, a small room with a single window that looked out onto the service alley. "This is where you'll change and store your belongings during the day. Your duties begin at 7 sharp and end at 6. Monday through Saturday. Sundays you're off unless there's special cleaning to be done. Your weekly salary is $300, paid every Friday. No advances, no exceptions." $300. Rosa calculated quickly in her head. After rent, utilities, groceries, and the money she sent to her aging aunt in Mexico, she would have perhaps $50 left each week. But it was work, honest work, and Rosa had learned long ago that dignity came not from the size of one's paycheck, but from the integrity with which one earned it. The first weeks at the Canterbury mansion were a masterclass in humiliation disguised as employment. Thomas, the butler, was a pompous man in his 50s who spoke with an affected British accent that fooled no one who had actually been to England. He delighted in giving Rosa impossible tasks, polishing silver that was already spotless, cleaning windows during rainstorms, reorganizing closets that no one ever opened. Elena, the cook, was perhaps the cruelest. A second-generation Italian-American who had worked her way up from poverty, she seemed to resent Rosa's presence as a reminder of her own humble beginnings. "Don't touch the good china," Elena would snap whenever Rosa entered the kitchen. "Girls like you break everything you touch." The worst part wasn't the extra work or the casual cruelty, it was the invisibility. Rosa would spend entire days in the mansion without seeing Richard Canterbury, though his presence filled every room like a storm cloud. She would hear his footsteps on the hardwood floors above. The sound of his voice during phone calls that seemed to consist entirely of numbers and percentages and anger. Through the staff gossip, Rosa learned that Richard's business empire was struggling. The technology sector investments that had made him wealthy were now bleeding money. His real estate portfolio, once worth $25 million, had lost nearly 30% of its value in the past year. Even his venture into cryptocurrency, which had initially tripled his liquid assets, was now underwater as Bitcoin and Ethereum crashed through the floor. But Rosa also learned something else through the fragments of overheard conversations and the sadness that seemed to emanate from the mansion's very foundation. Richard Canterbury wasn't just rich and grieving. He was utterly, completely alone. One evening in late March, as Rosa was finishing her cleaning in the main hallway, she heard something that made her pause. It was crying, not the dramatic sobbing of movies, but the quiet, desperate weeping of someone who thought no one could hear. The sound was coming from Richard's study, a room Rosa had been explicitly forbidden to enter. She stood frozen, her cleaning supplies in hand, listening to the raw pain of a man who had everything the world said he should want and nothing his soul actually needed. That night, Rosa went home to her small apartment and sat by her window, looking out at the lights of the city. She thought about her own losses, Miguel, who had died so young and so far from home, her mother, who had worked herself to death cleaning office buildings downtown, her father, who had disappeared when Rosa was 12, leaving behind only empty beer bottles and unpaid bills. She understood grief, understood how it could hollow out a person from the inside, leaving them standing upright but essentially empty. The next morning, Rosa arrived at the mansion to find chaos. Richard's youngest child, Emily, who was 8 years old and lived with her father only on weekends due to a bitter custody arrangement, had come down with a fever during the night. The child was alone in her bedroom, burning up with temperature, while the adult staff stood around arguing about whether to call a doctor or wait for Richard to return from a business trip to New York. Without asking permission, Rosa climbed the grand staircase to the children's wing. Emily's room was decorated in shades of pink and gold, with a canopy bed that looked like something from a fairy tale. But the little girl lying in that bed looked anything but magical. Her dark hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat, and her cheeks were flushed with fever. She was shivering despite being wrapped in heavy blankets. "Mija," Rosa whispered, using the endearment that came naturally to her lips. "You're burning up." Emily's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. "I want my mama," she whispered. Rosa's heart broke a little at the words. Margaret Canterbury had been dead for 5 years, but in her fever-induced delirium, Emily was calling for the one person who could never answer. Without hesitation, Rosa began to care for the child. She brought cool washcloths to bring down the fever, coaxed spoonfuls of water past Emily's cracked lips, and sat by the bed humming the same lullabies her own mother had sung to her decades ago in their tiny apartment in Guadalajara. As the afternoon wore on, Rosa's humming filled the silent mansion with something it hadn't heard in years: tenderness. She sang Las Mañanitas and La Llorona, her voice soft and soothing, carrying melodies that spoke of mothers and comfort and home. Emily's fever broke just as the sun was setting, painting the mansion's windows in shades of amber and gold. The child slept peacefully for the first time in hours, her breathing steady and calm. It was then that Rosa noticed him, Richard Canterbury, standing in the doorway of his daughter's bedroom, his expensive suit wrinkled from travel, his face a mask of exhaustion and something else. Gratitude, perhaps, or recognition. He didn't speak, but his eyes met Rosa's across the room, and for a moment, the barrier between employer and employee seemed to dissolve. Richard was 43 years old, with prematurely gray hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face was handsome in the way that money often makes faces handsome, well-groomed, well-fed, accustomed to deference. But standing in that doorway, watching his daughter sleep peacefully in the care of a woman he had barely acknowledged, Richard Canterbury looked younger somehow, more human. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Rosa simply nodded and gathered her things. As she passed him in the doorway, she could smell his cologne. Expensive, complex, nothing like the simple soap her own father had used. But underneath it, she detected something else: loneliness, sharp and bitter as winter wind. The next morning, Rosa found an envelope on the kitchen counter with her name written in Richard's strong handwriting. Inside was an extra $100 and a note that said simply, "For Emily. Thank you." It was the first personal acknowledgement she had received from him, and Rosa treasured it like the precious thing it was. But the gesture also marked the beginning of something dangerous in the Canterbury household. The other staff had noticed Richard's gratitude, and they didn't like it one bit. Mrs. Harrison began assigning Rosa the most degrading tasks she could imagine. Thomas started forgetting to give Rosa important messages about schedule changes, leaving her scrambling to complete impossible workloads. And Elena's cruelty reached new heights, going so far as to throw away Rosa's lunch, claiming the smell of her homemade tamales was offensive to the household. The cruelty might have broken a weaker person, but Rosa had survived poverty, loss, and the grinding indifference of 23 years in domestic service. She had learned to find strength in places others couldn't see, to protect her dignity like the fragile, precious thing it was. Each morning, she would stand in front of her bathroom mirror, look herself in the eyes, and remind herself of who she was: Rosa Delgado, daughter of Carmen and Eduardo, sister to Miguel the hero, survivor of storms that would have destroyed lesser souls. She was not invisible, no matter how hard others tried to make her so. The spring passed slowly, marked by small moments of grace that Rosa collected like treasures. There was the morning she found Richard sitting alone in the garden, staring at nothing, and she quietly brought him a cup of coffee without being asked. He accepted it with a nod that might have been gratitude. There was the day she discovered Emily's favorite stuffed animal torn and abandoned and spent her lunch break carefully sewing it back together with thread from her own sewing kit. There was the evening she stayed late to prepare a simple meal when the kitchen staff had all gone home, leaving Richard to fend for himself in his mansion full of expensive appliances he didn't know how to use. Each gesture was small, unremarkable to anyone watching, but they accumulated like snowflakes, slowly changing the landscape of the Canterbury household. Richard began to notice Rosa in ways that had nothing to do with the quality of her cleaning. He noticed that she hummed while she worked, filling the silent house with melodies he hadn't heard since Margaret's death. He noticed that Emily laughed more on weekends when Rosa was there, that his daughter's eyes lit up when she saw the woman who had cared for her through that terrible night of fever. He noticed that the flowers Rosa had quietly planted in the window boxes were beginning to bloom, bringing color to a house that had been gray for far too long. But perhaps most importantly, Richard began to notice the woman herself, her grace under pressure, her dignity in the face of petty cruelties, her capacity to give kindness to people who had given her nothing but coldness in return. It was a Tuesday in June when Rosa finally shared her story. She was cleaning Richard's study while he worked at his computer, the silence between them comfortable rather than awkward for the first time since she'd arrived. Richard had been reviewing quarterly reports that painted a grim picture of his financial empire. The technology investments continued to hemorrhage money. His real estate holdings were underwater, and his attempt to diversify into renewable energy stocks had backfired spectacularly. On paper, he was still worth millions, but the liquid cash was running out, and creditors were beginning to circle like vultures sensing carrion. "Mr. Canterbury," Rosa said quietly, breaking the silence, "may I ask you something?" Richard looked up, surprised by the question. In 4 months of employment, Rosa had never initiated a conversation with him. "Of course," he said, setting down his pen. "Your daughter, she called for her mother that night when she was sick." Rosa's voice was gentle, careful. "How long since you lost your wife?" 5 years, Richard replied, the words coming out rougher than he intended. 5 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Rosa nodded, understanding flickering in her dark eyes. "I lost my mother 7 years ago. Cancer, like your wife. And my brother Miguel. He died in Iraq the same year. Some months the loneliness still tries to drown me." Richard stared at her, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time since she'd arrived. This woman who cleaned his floors and dusted his furniture had losses that mirrored his own, grief that ran as deep as any river. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "I learned something, though," Rosa continued, turning back to her dusting. "The people we lose, they don't want us to stop living. They want us to find ways to honor them by living better, loving more." She paused by a photograph of Margaret, smiling in a silver frame on Richard's desk. "Your wife was very beautiful." "She was," Richard agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "She was everything good about this house." "Then maybe," Rosa said softly, "the way to honor her is to let some of that good back in." That conversation, brief as it was, marked a turning point in the Canterbury household. Richard began to see Rosa not as hired help, but as a fellow traveler on the difficult road of grief. He started leaving his study door open while she cleaned, occasionally sharing observations about his work or asking her opinion on small matters. Rosa, in turn, began to relax her guard slightly, allowing glimpses of her personality to show through the professional facade she had maintained for months. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the mansion began to change. Rosa's wildflowers bloomed in the window boxes, bringing splashes of yellow and purple to the austere facade. Emily began spending more time at the house, drawn by Rosa's presence and the way the woman made the cold halls feel warmer, more welcoming. Even the other family members, Richard's older son David, who visited occasionally from college, and his teenage daughter Sarah, who came for summer visitation, seemed to notice that something in the house was different. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was like watching ice melt in spring, gradual, natural, inevitable. Rosa would hum while cleaning, and the melodies would drift through rooms that had been silent for years. She would prepare simple meals on the nights when Elena was off duty, filling the kitchen with aromas that spoke of home and comfort rather than obligation. She would tend to Emily when the little girl was sad or lonely, offering the kind of maternal care that no amount of money could purchase. Richard found himself looking forward to the days when Rosa was working. Her presence brought a sense of peace to the house that he had thought was lost forever. He began to trust her with more responsibility, asking her to help coordinate Emily's schedule, to prepare the guest rooms when business associates visited, to handle small household crises with the calm competence she brought to everything she touched. But the other staff members watched these developments with growing resentment and alarm. Mrs. Harrison, who had ruled the household staff with iron-fisted authority for over a decade, saw Rosa's growing influence as a direct threat to her position. Thomas, who prided himself on being Richard's most trusted employee, couldn't understand why his boss suddenly seemed to value the opinion of a cleaning woman over his own. And Elena, whose jealousy had been simmering for months, finally reached her boiling point. It was Walter Canterbury, Richard's eldest son and business partner, who provided the match to light the fire of conspiracy that would nearly destroy everything Rosa had built. Walter was 28 years old, ambitious and ruthless, with an MBA from Northwestern and a calculating intelligence that had made him invaluable to his father's business empire. He was also deeply threatened by any sign that his father might be emerging from the protective shell of grief that had made Richard increasingly dependent on his son's judgment and guidance. Walter had been handling more and more of the day-to-day business operations as Richard's depression had deepened over the past 5 years. He controlled access to financial information, managed relationships with key investors, and had gradually positioned himself as the heir apparent to the Canterbury fortune. The last thing he wanted was for his father to regain the emotional stability and clear judgment that might lead to uncomfortable questions about some of Walter's more aggressive business decisions. When Mrs. Harrison approached Walter with concerns about Rosa's inappropriate influence on Richard, she found a receptive audience. Walter had noticed the changes in his father, the improved mood, the increased interest in Emily's well-being, the signs that Richard might be emerging from the depressive fog that had enveloped him since Margaret's death. From Walter's perspective, these were not positive developments. They were threats to the carefully constructed power structure that had served his ambitions so well. The conspiracy that developed over the following weeks was both petty and devastating. Mrs. Harrison began documenting every minor mistake Rosa made, every moment she spent talking with Richard instead of cleaning, every small kindness she showed Emily that could be construed as overstepping her boundaries. Thomas started planting seeds of doubt about Rosa's background, wondering aloud whether anyone had really checked her references, whether she might have ulterior motives for being so helpful and accommodating. Elena contributed her own poison, whispering about missing food items, suggesting that Rosa might be stealing from the household supplies, claiming that her friendliness toward the family was suspicious and probably calculated. And Walter orchestrated it all, feeding the resentments and paranoia of the household staff while presenting himself to his father as the voice of reason and fiscal responsibility. "Dad," he said during one of their regular business meetings, "I'm concerned about household security. We have a lot of valuable items in the house, and some of the staff have raised concerns about the new cleaning woman. Maybe we should consider reviewing her employment." Richard, who had been going through financial statements showing continued losses in his investment portfolio, barely looked up from the papers. "Rosa, she's been excellent. Emily adores her, and she's the first person we've hired in years who actually seems to care about the job." "That's exactly what worries me," Walter replied. "People who seem too good to be true usually are." The trap, when it was finally sprung, was both elegant and cruel in its simplicity. On a rainy Thursday in early September, as Rosa was cleaning Richard's home office, Mrs. Harrison burst in with Thomas close behind her. In Mrs. Harrison's hand was a manila folder containing important financial documents, contracts, investment certificates, and banking information that represented millions of dollars in assets. "Mr. Canterbury," Mrs. Harrison said, her voice shaking with manufactured outrage, "I found this in the cleaning supplies closet, hidden under a pile of rags and cleaning products." Richard looked up from his computer, confusion evident on his face. "What is it?" "Your personal financial documents," Thomas said smoothly. "The ones that went missing from your desk 3 days ago. The ones we've been searching for all over the house." Rosa froze, her cleaning supplies scattered around her feet. She looked from the folder to Richard's face, watching as understanding dawned in his eyes. The implication was clear. She had stolen the documents and hidden them, perhaps to sell the information or use it for blackmail. "I don't understand," Rosa said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her chest. "I've never seen those papers before." "They were in your cleaning supplies," Mrs. Harrison repeated, her voice rising. "Under the rags you used to dust furniture. How do you explain that?" Rosa had no explanation because there was none to give. Someone had planted the documents among her belongings, but saying so would sound like the desperate lie of a person caught in theft. She looked at Richard, hoping to see some flicker of trust in his eyes, some acknowledgement of the months of faithful service, the care she had shown for Emily, the quiet companionship they had shared. Instead, she saw the cold mask that had descended over his features, the same expression of distant indifference that had greeted her on her first day at the mansion. The businessman had returned, and the man who had begun to trust her was nowhere to be seen. "I think you should go," Richard said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Clear out your things and leave immediately." Rosa nodded once, gathering her cleaning supplies with hands that trembled only slightly. She had survived worse betrayals than this, endured deeper humiliations, weathered storms that had broken stronger people than herself. But as she walked through the halls of the mansion for the last time, past the wildflowers that were just beginning to bloom in the window boxes, she felt something inside her chest crack like ice under pressure. Rosa left the Canterbury mansion on that gray September afternoon, with her dignity intact, but her heart shattered into pieces she wasn't sure she could ever put back together again. She walked to the bus stop in the rain, her worn shoes splashing through puddles that reflected the iron-colored sky, and tried not to think about Emily's face when the little girl discovered that the woman who had sewn her stuffed animal back together was gone forever. The bus ride back to Pilsen seemed longer than usual, each stop carrying her farther away from the life she had briefly allowed herself to hope might be different. As the city blurred past the rain-streaked windows, Rosa stared at her reflection and wondered if she should have known better than to let herself care about people who saw her as nothing more than a convenience to be discarded when it suited them. Her apartment felt smaller and shabbier than ever when she finally climbed the 4 flights of stairs to her door. The radiator was still rattling. The walls were still thin enough to hear every argument and celebration from her neighbors, and the view from her single window was still nothing more than the brick wall of the building next door. But it was honest, this small life of hers. It was built on work she could be proud of, relationships with people who saw her as she truly was, and a community that valued her for reasons that had nothing to do with her usefulness to others. Rosa made herself a simple dinner of rice and beans, the same meal she had eaten thousands of times before, and tried to convince herself that she was relieved to be free of the Canterbury mansion and its complicated family dynamics. But late that night, as she lay in bed listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into sleep, she found herself thinking about the wildflowers she had planted, wondering who would water them now that she was gone. In the mansion in Lincoln Park, the silence returned with a vengeance. Emily cried for 3 days when she learned that Rosa had been let go, though Richard couldn't bring himself to explain the circumstances of the dismissal to his 8-year-old daughter. The child's distress was so intense that Richard's ex-wife called to demand an explanation for Emily's sudden unhappiness. "She keeps asking for Rosa," Patricia said during their tense phone conversation. "She says Rosa was the only person in that mausoleum you call a home who actually paid attention to her." "What did you do?" Richard couldn't answer because he didn't know what he had done, only that the house felt emptier and colder than it had in months. The wildflowers in the window boxes began to wilt without Rosa's careful tending. The melodies that had drifted through the halls were replaced by an oppressive quiet that seemed to press against the walls like a living thing. Even Mrs. Harrison's victory felt hollow. She had gotten rid of the woman she saw as a threat to her authority, but the household she now ruled felt more lifeless than ever before. It was David, Richard's middle child, who first began to voice doubts about what had happened. David was home from college for a brief visit and noticed immediately that something fundamental had changed in the house. "Where's the cleaning lady Emily liked so much?" he asked during dinner. "Rosa," Richard's voice was carefully neutral. "She's no longer employed here." "Why?" David pressed. "Emily said she was the best thing about visiting this place." "There were some trust issues," Richard replied, hoping his son would drop the subject. But David had inherited his father's persistence along with his business acumen. Over the following weeks, he began asking questions of the household staff, piecing together the story of Rosa's dismissal and the circumstances surrounding it. What he discovered made him increasingly uncomfortable. Thomas's account of finding the documents seemed rehearsed and overly detailed. Mrs. Harrison's righteous indignation felt performed rather than genuine. And Elena's sudden willingness to discuss Rosa's suspicious behavior was completely out of character for a woman who usually kept her opinions to herself. Most troubling of all was Walter's role in the entire affair. David had always been somewhat wary of his older brother's ambitions, but the more he learned about Rosa's dismissal, the more he began to suspect that Walter had orchestrated the entire thing. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when David was helping his father organize some business documents and found the manila folder that had supposedly been stolen by Rosa. Hidden inside was a handwritten note in Walter's familiar scrawl. "Dad moved these to the safe. Market volatility makes me nervous about having this info lying around. W." The note was dated 2 days before Rosa's dismissal. David stared at the note for a long moment, understanding flooding through him like ice water in his veins. Walter had moved the documents himself and forgotten to tell anyone. When they went missing from Richard's desk, he had allowed, or perhaps encouraged, the staff to blame Rosa rather than admit his own oversight. The realization that his brother had destroyed an innocent woman's reputation to cover up his own mistake filled David with a rage that surprised him with its intensity. That evening, David confronted Walter in the study where Rosa had spent so many hours quietly cleaning while Richard worked. "I found your note," he said without preamble, placing the handwritten slip of paper on the desk between them. Walter's face went pale, but he quickly recovered his composure. "What note?" "The one you wrote to Dad about moving the financial documents, the same documents Rosa was accused of stealing." Walter was silent for a moment, calculating his response. When he spoke, his voice was calm and reasonable. The tone he used to close difficult business deals. "Look, David, that woman was getting too close to Dad. She was manipulating him, taking advantage of his grief. Maybe I made a mistake about the documents, but—" "You destroyed her life," David interrupted, his voice shaking with controlled fury. "You let an innocent woman be branded as a thief and fired in disgrace because you were too proud to admit you made a simple error." "She was just a cleaning lady," Walter said dismissively. "She'll find another job." The casual cruelty of that statement, the reduction of Rosa's dignity and humanity to nothing more than her job title, broke something inside David that he wasn't sure could ever be repaired. That night, he called his father and requested a meeting. Richard, who had been struggling with insomnia and a growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with his life, agreed to see his son the next morning. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Richard's life. David laid out the evidence of Walter's deception systematically, methodically, leaving no room for doubt or denial. He showed his father the note, explained the timeline of events, and forced Richard to confront the terrible truth that he had allowed his grief and paranoia to blind him to an injustice of staggering proportions. Richard sat in stunned silence as the full magnitude of what had happened sank in. Rosa had been innocent. Completely, utterly innocent. She had given his household months of faithful service, had tended to his sick daughter with genuine care, had brought light and warmth to a house that had been dying by degrees, and he had repaid her kindness by believing the worst of her without question, by throwing her out of his home like discarded trash. The guilt that crashed down on Richard was unlike anything he had experienced, even during the darkest days after Margaret's death. That grief had been clean, honest, the natural response to losing someone he loved. This was different, a corrosive shame that ate at his soul like acid. He had become the kind of man he had always despised, wealthy, powerful, and utterly indifferent to the humanity of those who served him. For 3 days, Richard couldn't bring himself to leave his study. He sat surrounded by the symbols of his success, the awards, the photographs with politicians and business leaders, the financial statements that proved his worth in dollars and cents, and realized that none of it mattered if he had lost the basic decency that should define any human being. He thought about Rosa's face on the day she was dismissed, the way her dignity had remained intact even as her world was collapsing around her. He remembered her gentle voice as she hummed lullabies to Emily, the way she had tended his sick daughter without being asked, the quiet grace with which she had endured months of petty cruelties from his household staff. Most of all, he remembered her words about honoring Margaret by learning to love more, letting good back into the house. Rosa had tried to teach him how to live again, and he had repaid her by believing the worst of her without question. On the 4th day, Richard made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find Rosa Delgado, and he was going to make things right. It wouldn't be easy. He didn't even know where she lived, and his pride would have to be swallowed completely for him to approach her after what he had done. But not making the attempt would mean living with a guilt that would poison whatever years remained to him. Richard had learned, too late perhaps, that some mistakes couldn't be fixed with money or power. They could only be addressed through the much harder work of genuine contrition and the hope that forgiveness might still be possible. The search for Rosa took Richard into parts of Chicago he had never seen, despite living in the city for over 40 years. He started with the employment agency that had placed her with his household, but they cited privacy policies and refused to provide her address or phone number. He hired a private investigator, but the man's clinical approach to finding Rosa felt wrong somehow, like hiring someone to track down a possession rather than locate a human being he had wronged. In the end, it was Emily who provided the breakthrough. During one of her weekend visits, she mentioned that Rosa had once talked about her neighborhood, about the murals on the buildings and the vendor who sold the best tamales in Chicago from a cart on the corner of 18th and Ashland. Richard had never paid attention to these small details when Rosa shared them, but Emily had absorbed them with a child's perfect memory for the things that truly mattered. On a crisp Saturday morning in November, nearly 3 months after Rosa's dismissal, Richard drove his Mercedes into Pilsen for the first time in his life. The neighborhood was nothing like Lincoln Park. The buildings were older, smaller, painted in vibrant colors that spoke of communities that refused to let poverty steal their joy. Murals covered entire walls, depicting everything from Aztec warriors to modern families, from abstract designs to portraits of local heroes. The streets were alive with activity, children playing in small parks, families shopping at corner stores, elderly men gathered around domino tables in front of restaurants. Richard felt completely out of place in his expensive suit and luxury car, but he was determined to find Rosa and make whatever amends were still possible. He parked near the corner Emily had mentioned and began walking, looking for any sign of the woman whose life he had helped destroy. It was the smell that led him to her, the aroma of fresh tortillas and slow-cooked meat that Rosa had mentioned during their brief conversations about her mother's recipes. Following his nose, Richard found himself outside a small restaurant called Carmen's Cocina, named, he would later learn, for Rosa's deceased mother. Through the window, he could see her working behind the counter, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her movements efficient and graceful as she prepared orders for a line of customers. She looked older somehow, and there was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there during her time at the mansion, but her dignity remained intact, unbroken by the injustice she had suffered. Richard stood outside the restaurant for nearly an hour, gathering the courage to go inside and face the woman he had wronged so deeply. Part of him hoped she wouldn't recognize him, that he could somehow approach her as a stranger and avoid the full weight of her justified anger. But when Rosa looked up from the counter and saw him through the window, her recognition was immediate and complete. Their eyes met across the glass, and Richard saw in her gaze not anger, but something worse. Disappointment so profound, it seemed to cut right through him. Rosa finished serving her customers and then walked outside to where Richard stood on the sidewalk, looking as out of place as a peacock in a chicken coop. She didn't speak, but simply waited for him to explain why he had come to her neighborhood, invaded her new life, brought the shadow of his wealth and privilege to her humble sanctuary. "Rosa," Richard began, then stopped, realizing that he had prepared no speech, crafted no explanation that could possibly encompass the magnitude of his mistake. "I know about the documents," he said finally. "I know Walter moved them. I know you were innocent." Rosa nodded slowly, as if this wasn't news to her but merely confirmation of something she had always known would eventually come to light. "Yes," she said simply. "I was innocent." "I'm sorry," Richard continued, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "I'm so incredibly sorry for what I put you through, for not believing in you when I should have, for letting my own grief and paranoia blind me to your character." Rosa listened in silence, her face giving no indication of her thoughts or feelings. When Richard finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment, considering his words and perhaps the man who had spoken them. "Mr. Canterbury," she said finally, her voice gentle but firm, "I never wanted your money or your pity. I just wanted a place to belong, to do honest work for honest pay. You took that away from me because it was easier to believe the worst than to trust what you had seen with your own eyes." The truth of her words hit Richard like a physical blow. She was right, completely right, and there was nothing he could say in his own defense. He had chosen the easy path of suspicion over the harder road of trust, and an innocent woman had paid the price for his cowardice. "I know I don't have any right to ask," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but is there anything I can do to make this right? Any way I can repair the damage I've caused?" Rosa looked at him for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to determine whether his contrition was genuine or merely another form of manipulation. What she saw there must have satisfied her, because her expression softened slightly. "There is one thing," she said. "Emily. How is she?" The question caught Richard off guard. After everything that had happened, after the injustice and humiliation she had endured, Rosa's first concern was still for his daughter. The generosity of spirit that required left him momentarily speechless. "She misses you terribly," Richard admitted. "She's been asking about you since the day you left. I haven't known what to tell her." Rosa nodded, pain flickering across her features. "Tell her that Rosa thinks of her every day. That she should be strong and kind, like her mother would have wanted her to be." "Would you," Richard began, then stopped himself. How could he ask this woman to return to a house where she had been treated so badly, to work for a family that had shown her nothing but betrayal and suspicion? But Rosa seemed to understand what he couldn't bring himself to voice. "I can't come back, Mr. Canterbury," she said gently. "That part of my life is over. But maybe you could bring Emily here sometime. Let her see how I'm doing, know that I'm okay." It was a generosity Richard knew he didn't deserve, but he accepted it gratefully. They arranged for Emily to visit the following weekend, and as Richard walked back to his car, he felt something shift inside his chest. It wasn't forgiveness. Rosa hadn't offered that, and he wasn't sure he would have been able to accept it if she had. But it was something else. The possibility of grace, the chance that even his failures might be transformed into something resembling wisdom. The visit between Rosa and Emily was everything Richard had hoped it would be, and more. Emily's face lit up when she saw the woman who had cared for her during her illness, and Rosa's eyes filled with tears as she hugged the child she had worried about for months. They spent the afternoon together, Rosa showing Emily the neighborhood murals, sharing stories about the food and the community, treating her not as the daughter of a wealthy family, but as a child, deserving of love and attention. Watching Rosa's interaction with Emily, Richard finally understood what he had lost when he allowed his staff to drive her away. It wasn't just a competent employee. It was a woman with the rare gift of seeing people as they truly were, not as their wealth or status defined them. Rosa had seen Emily as a lonely little girl in need of maternal care, had seen Richard as a grieving widower struggling to connect with his life, had seen the Canterbury mansion not as a symbol of success, but as a home that had forgotten how to be lived in. Over the following months, Richard continued to bring Emily to visit Rosa in Pilsen. These visits became the bright spots in his daughter's schedule, and slowly they began to heal something in Richard as well. Being in Rosa's presence again reminded him of the man he had been trying to become before fear and pride had derailed his progress. He began to make other changes in his life, firing Walter from his business operations after confronting him about the deception, restructuring his household staff to eliminate the toxic dynamics that had poisoned his home, and most importantly, learning to see his employees as human beings rather than functions to be performed. The financial losses that had been bleeding his empire began to stabilize as Richard's judgment, no longer clouded by depression and paranoia, returned to its former sharpness. His investments in renewable energy, previously underwater, began to show promise as market conditions changed. Even his cryptocurrency holdings, which had seemed like total losses, began to recover as Bitcoin and other currencies rallied. But more important than the financial recovery was the emotional healing taking place within Richard himself. The guilt he carried over his treatment of Rosa would never fully disappear, but it had been transformed into something more constructive, a determination to live with greater wisdom and compassion. He began volunteering at local charities, making donations to organizations that served the immigrant communities from which Rosa had come, and most importantly, raising Emily with an understanding of the dignity and worth of every human being, regardless of their social or economic status. It was Emily who suggested, on a spring afternoon nearly 2 years after Rosa's dismissal, that they invite Rosa to dinner at the mansion. She could see if her flowers grew back, Emily said with the simple logic of a child who believed all wounds could heal if attended with sufficient love. Richard was hesitant. The mansion held painful memories for Rosa, and he wasn't sure she would want to return to the scene of her humiliation. But when he extended the invitation, Rosa surprised him by accepting. Perhaps she, too, was ready to transform a painful memory into something more hopeful. The dinner that took place on a warm evening in May was nothing like the formal affairs the Canterbury mansion had once hosted. Instead of an elaborate menu prepared by professional caterers, Rosa insisted on cooking the meal herself, simple Mexican dishes that filled the house with aromas of cumin, cilantro, and love. Emily helped in the kitchen, learning to make tortillas under Rosa's patient guidance, her laughter echoing through halls that had been silent for far too long. David and Sarah, Richard's older children, joined them for the meal, and for the first time in years, the Canterbury family sat around their dining room table, sharing food, stories, and genuine affection. Rosa had brought a small potted wildflower as a gift, the same type she had planted in the mansion's window boxes years before. After dinner, they walked through the house together, and Richard was amazed to see how different it looked through Rosa's eyes. Where he saw expensive furniture and valuable artwork, she noticed the way sunlight fell across the floors, the view of the garden from the living room windows, the family photographs that told the story of love and loss and eventual healing. "It feels like a home now," Rosa said as they stood in the hallway where she had once cleaned quietly while Richard worked. "Before, it was just a place where people lived. Now there's life in it again." As the evening drew to a close, Richard walked Rosa to her car, a modest used Honda that represented the financial constraints she continued to navigate as a restaurant worker. The contrast between her circumstances and his wealth was as stark as ever, but somehow that mattered less than it once had. What mattered was the grace she had shown him, the forgiveness she had offered through her actions if not her words, and the wisdom she had shared simply by living her life with dignity and compassion. "Rosa," Richard said as she prepared to leave, "I need you to know that you changed my life. Not just by showing me how wrong I was about that day, but by showing me what it means to live with true strength." Rosa smiled, the first completely unguarded smile Richard had seen from her since the early days of her employment. "Mr. Canterbury," she said, "we all make mistakes. What matters is what we choose to do with them afterward." 5 years have passed since that dinner, and the transformation of the Canterbury family has been complete but quiet, marked by small daily choices rather than grand gestures. Richard's business empire has not only recovered but thrived, guided by his renewed clarity of judgment and ethical decision-making. His relationship with Emily has deepened into the kind of father-daughter bond that will sustain them both through whatever challenges life may bring. David has joined the family business, bringing his own values and vision to work alongside his father's experience. Even Sarah, now in college, speaks with pride about the changes in her family and the lessons she learned from watching her father confront his failures and grow from them. Rosa continues to work at Carmen's Cocina, but her relationship with the Canterbury family has evolved into something that transcends the boundaries of employer and employee. She is Emily's honorary grandmother, David's mentor in understanding the dignity of service, and Richard's reminder that true wealth lies not in what one accumulates, but in how one treats others. The Canterbury mansion still stands in Lincoln Park, but it has been transformed into something its original builders never envisioned, a genuine home where laughter echoes through the halls, where the kitchen is used for family meals rather than just formal entertaining, and where the wildflowers Rosa once planted have spread to cover the entire garden in riotous color. On Emily's 12th birthday, Richard announced that he had established a scholarship fund in Rosa's name, a program designed to provide educational opportunities for the children of domestic workers, recognizing that the hands that clean our homes often belong to people with dreams that extend far beyond the limitations others would impose on them. Rosa wept when she learned about the scholarship, not because she needed the recognition, but because she understood what it represented, the final transformation of a painful memory into a force for good in the world. The scholarship fund has already provided college tuition for dozens of young people who might never have had such opportunities otherwise. Each recipient represents not just an individual success story, but a family's validation, a community's pride, and a society's slow recognition that dignity and worth are not determined by the work one does, but by the character one brings to that work. But the true measure of Rosa's impact extends far beyond the formal recognition of scholarships and charitable donations. It lives in the small daily choices that the Canterbury family makes now. The way Richard greets every employee by name, the respect Emily shows to service workers wherever she goes, the understanding that David brings to his business dealings with people from all walks of life. These changes ripple outward like stones dropped in still water, creating waves of kindness and recognition that touch lives in ways that cannot be measured or quantified. The story of Rosa and Richard has become something of a legend in Pilsen, told and retold in the restaurants and shops where Rosa is known and loved. But it's also become a different kind of story in Lincoln Park, where the Canterbury family's transformation has inspired other wealthy families to examine their own relationships with the people who serve them. Change, real change, often begins with a single story of redemption, a single example of what becomes possible when pride gives way to humility, and suspicion is replaced by trust. In the quiet moments of her life, early mornings when she opens Carmen's Cocina before the breakfast rush, late evenings when she tends to the small garden behind her apartment building, Sunday afternoons when Emily visits and they cook together. Rosa sometimes reflects on the strange journey that brought her from those painful months of betrayal to this place of peace and purpose. She thinks about her mother, Carmen, who would have been proud to see the restaurant that bears her name serving not just food, but hope to the community. She thinks about Miguel, her brother the hero, who understood before his death that true service means seeing the humanity in every person we encounter. And yes, she thinks about Richard Canterbury, the wealthy man who learned the hardest lesson of all, that our greatest failures can become our most important teachers if we have the courage to face them honestly and the wisdom to let them change us. The inscription on the scholarship fund reads simply, "In honor of Rosa Delgado, who taught us that dignity cannot be taken away, only recognized or ignored." But Rosa herself would say that the true inscription should read differently. "In honor of the truth that we are all capable of growth, all deserving of second chances, and all responsible for creating a world where kindness matters more than status and character counts more than wealth." There are thousands of Rosas in Chicago, millions across the country, women and men who rise before dawn to care for other people's homes, other people's children, other people's lives. They ride crowded buses and trains to neighborhoods they could never afford to live in, carrying with them the hopes and dreams that sustain them through long days of invisible labor. Most will never have their stories told, never receive recognition for the ways they hold together the fabric of daily life for families too busy or too privileged to notice their contributions. But each one carries within herself the same dignity that Rosa Delgado carried, the same strength that enabled her to survive injustice and emerge with her humanity intact. And in a world that too often values people based on what they can produce rather than who they are, these invisible workers serve as daily reminders of a truth that should be self-evident but somehow needs constant reinforcing, that every human being deserves respect, recognition, and the chance to be seen as more than the sum of their economic circumstances. The Canterbury mansion still stands, its Georgian facade now softened by Rosa's wildflowers, which have indeed spread throughout the garden just as Emily predicted. The house hosts dinner parties again, but they're different now. Gatherings that bring together people from all walks of life, conversations that cross traditional boundaries of class and culture, meals that celebrate the simple human joy of sharing food, and stories with people we care about. Richard sometimes stands in his study, looking out at the garden where Rosa's flowers bloom in profusion, and marvels at how different his life became once he learned to see past his own pain. The financial statements and investment portfolios that once seemed so important are still there, still require attention, still provide the material foundation for his family's security. But they no longer define his sense of worth or his understanding of success. True success, he learned, is measured in the quality of relationships we build, the kindness we show to those who serve us, and the wisdom we gain from confronting our own failures with honesty and humility. Emily, now 15, often brings friends from school to visit Rosa's restaurant. These teenagers, raised in privilege but taught to value character over status, represent perhaps the most important legacy of Rosa's influence on the Canterbury family. They see in Rosa not a former employee, but a woman of wisdom and grace, someone whose stories about resilience and survival provide lessons that no amount of formal education could teach. The neighborhood of Pilsen has changed too, gentrification bringing new challenges as rising rents threaten to displace the very communities that give the area its character and soul. But Carmen's Cocina remains, an anchor of authenticity in a changing landscape, thanks in part to the quiet financial support that Richard provides, not as charity, but as investment in the human community that Rosa represents. The restaurant has become more than just a place to eat. It's a cultural center where children come to do homework after school, where elderly residents gather to share stories and play dominoes, where young mothers find support and friendship during difficult times. Rosa moves through it all with the same quiet grace she brought to the Canterbury mansion, seeing needs before they're spoken, offering comfort without being asked, creating space for dignity and hope in a world that too often offers neither. She never remarries, though there are men in the community who would welcome her love. Instead, she pours her maternal energy into the extended family of neighbors and customers and friends who recognize in her something precious and rare. A woman who has survived betrayal without becoming bitter, who has endured injustice without losing faith in the possibility of redemption. Her apartment above the restaurant is small but beautiful. Filled with plants she tends with the same care she once brought to the Canterbury garden, decorated with photographs that tell the story of a life rich in relationships, if not material wealth. On her dresser sits the photograph of Miguel in his military uniform. Beside it, a picture of Emily at her high school graduation, and next to that, a snapshot from the dinner at the Canterbury mansion, when forgiveness finally found its way into hearts that had been closed too long. Sunday evenings. When the restaurant is closed, Rosa often sits by her window and watches the life of the neighborhood unfold below. Children playing in the small park across the street, families walking home from evening church services, teenagers gathered around the corner store sharing dreams and laughter. This is her kingdom. These are her people. And in choosing to remain here, rather than accepting Richard's offers to help her find better opportunities elsewhere, she has made a statement about what truly matters in life. Community matters. Belonging matters. The simple dignity of being known and valued by people who see you clearly matters more than all the luxury and status that money can buy. Richard understands this now, in ways he could never have comprehended during the years when grief made him hard and wealth insulated him from the real struggles of real people. His own Sunday evenings are often spent in reflection, sometimes reading the letters he receives from scholarship recipients, sometimes just sitting in his garden among Rosa's wildflowers, marveling at how much beauty can grow from the soil of past mistakes. The scholarship fund has expanded beyond its original scope, now providing not just tuition assistance but mentorship programs, job training initiatives, and support for small businesses in immigrant communities. It operates quietly, without fanfare, guided by Rosa's principle that true service seeks to empower rather than to seek recognition. Each year, the scholarship recipients gather for a dinner at the Canterbury mansion, their diverse faces and stories filling the rooms that once echoed only with loneliness and grief. These young people, future teachers and nurses, engineers and artists, entrepreneurs and social workers, represent the multiplying effect of one woman's refusal to let injustice make her cruel. They carry forward Rosa's legacy of dignity and determination, proof that when we invest in human potential rather than simply consuming human labor, miracles become commonplace. The last recipient to speak at this year's dinner was Maria Santos, daughter of a hotel cleaning woman, granddaughter of migrant farm workers, now a medical student at Northwestern University. She spoke about the patient care her grandmother had taught her by example. The lesson that healing happens not just through technical skill, but through the simple recognition of shared humanity. My abuela never went to medical school, Maria told the gathered crowd, but she understood the medicine of seeing people truly, of offering comfort when cure is impossible, of maintaining hope when circumstances seem hopeless. The Rosa Delgado Scholarship didn't just pay for my education, it reminded me that my family's tradition of caring for others has always been a form of medicine. And now I get to practice that medicine in a hospital instead of a hotel room. Rosa, seated at the place of honor beside Richard, wiped tears from her eyes as she listened to Maria speak. This is what redemption looks like, she thought, not the dramatic moment of forgiveness, but the quiet miracle of lives transformed, opportunities created, and dignity recognized across generations. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and the dishes had been cleared away, Rosa and Richard walked through the garden together, two people who had learned that the most important journeys are not from one place to another, but from one way of being to another. The wildflowers were particularly beautiful that night, their colors muted, but still visible in the moonlight, their fragrance carrying on the warm spring breeze. "Do you ever regret it?" Richard asked quietly. "Not taking my offer to help you start your own business, to move to a better neighborhood?" Rosa smiled, the same gentle smile that had once brought peace to a sick child and hope to a grieving father. "Mr. Canterbury," she said, using the formal address she had never quite abandoned despite years of friendship. "I learned a long time ago that better is not always bigger, and opportunities are not always what they appear to be. I have work that matters to me, people who value me, and the knowledge that my life has made a difference. What more could anyone want?" Richard nodded, understanding flooding through him as it always did when Rosa spoke with such simple wisdom. They stood in comfortable silence, surrounded by the flowers that had become symbols of transformation, listening to the sounds of the city settling into sleep around them. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the lake, carrying commuters home to neighborhoods throughout Chicago, each person carrying their own stories of struggle and hope, dignity and dreams. "Thank you," Richard said finally, the words carrying all the weight of years of gratitude that could never be fully expressed. "Thank you," Rosa replied, her voice soft in the darkness, "for learning to see what was always there." They parted that night as they always did, with the formal respect that had evolved into genuine affection, each returning to their own life, enriched by the friendship that had grown from the ashes of betrayal and mistrust. But their story continues, not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in the daily choice to treat each person they encounter with the dignity that Rosa had demanded for herself and taught others to offer freely. And you, yes, you who have listened to this story while folding clothes or washing dishes or commuting home from your own honest work, you are part of this story too. Every time you recognize the humanity in someone whose service makes your life easier, every time you offer respect to someone whose economic circumstances differ from your own, every time you choose to see people as fully human rather than simply functional, you are writing your own chapter in Rosa's continuing story. The scholarship bearing her name will outlive both Rosa and Richard, creating opportunities for young people not yet born, in communities not yet imagined. But the real legacy of Rosa Delgado lives in something more immediate and more powerful. The understanding that dignity is not something that can be granted or withheld by others, but something we carry within ourselves and offer to each other through the simple recognition that we are all, fundamentally, deserving of respect and kindness. In a world that too often reduces people to their economic function, Rosa's story reminds us that the woman who cleans your office might be supporting her grandchildren's education. The man who serves your coffee might be an artist creating beauty in his spare time. The teenager who bags your groceries might be the first in her family to attend college. Each person you encounter carries dreams and struggles, hopes and sorrows, dignity and worth that extend far beyond the brief moment of your interaction. Rosa Delgado, daughter of Carmen and Eduardo, sister to Miguel the hero, honorary grandmother to Emily Canterbury, friend to Richard, mentor to Maria and countless others. Her name is carved now in marble at the entrance to the Scholarship Center, but her true monument lives in the hearts and minds of all who learned from her example that grace under pressure is possible, that forgiveness without forgotten dignity is achievable, and that the most profound transformations come not from changing our circumstances, but from changing our understanding of what it means to be truly human. This is her story, but it is also yours. The next time you encounter someone whose service makes your life easier, the person who cleans your building, who prepares your food, who cares for your children, who tends your garden, remember Rosa. See them clearly, recognize their dignity, offer your respect, and know that in doing so, you are participating in the ongoing miracle of human transformation, one interaction at a time, one moment of recognition at a time, one choice to honor our shared humanity at a time. The wildflowers in Richard Canterbury's garden bloom each spring, as they have for 15 years now, spreading beauty and color through careful tending and natural growth. They serve as a living reminder that the most beautiful things in life often grow from the simplest seeds: a moment of kindness, a choice to see clearly, a decision to value character over status, and the recognition that we are all, in our own ways, gardeners in each other's lives.